It was all a lie. The only way to settle the Great Plains, no man's land, was through lies. Cities like Boise City, Oklahoma were founded on fraud. Even the name itself was a lie. The promoters pronounced it Boise City from the French word les bois, which means trees. But in no man's land, there were no trees, not even a city. It was said you could grow cotton or wheat on rich land just outside the city limits. This too was a lie, for the land was the flattest, driest, most wind-raked, and least arable part of the United States. Corn and wheat were the only crops that grew in these lands. When the United States issued a proclamation during World War I to the plains, plant more wheat to win the war, there was a great frenzy and thousands migrated to the Great Plains to turn over the ground and try to produce as much wheat as possible to sell abroad. Among those arriving were the suitcase farmers who had no intention of settling. All they wanted was to rent out a tractor and a piece of ground for a few days, plant some wheat into the fresh turned fold, and then come back next summer for the payoff. Then wheat prices dropped. All the wheat that had been planted was forgotten. This abuse of the land is what leads to the environmental changes in the Great Plains. Frequent cultivation optimized conditions for wind erosion during the drought and high winds of the 1930s. The eroding soil not only prevented the growth of plants, it uprooted established ones. Sediment filled fence rows, stream channels, road ditches, and farmsteads. Dirt coated the insides of buildings. Airborne dust also impaired breathing and caused respiratory diseases. Colorado, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Nebraska were the areas that were affected by the dust storms. And to stop these storms, the people began to plant trees from east to west in rows in order to create an effective wind barrier and check erosion. Not only did they plant trees, but they also planted weeds to hold the ground. Montana lost half of their population between 1910 and 1930, while Cimarron County, Oklahoma grew by 70% and Dalham County, Texas doubled its population during the same time. Montana had killer winters with temperatures of -40. That was not a problem in the Great Plains. Not only were people migrating into the Great Plains due to climate issues, but the federal government was so anxious to settle the land that they offered free train rides to pilgrims looking to prove up a piece of dry land. The slogan was health, wealth, and opportunity. For those reasons, people migrated to the Great Plains, but when the drought and dust storms began, people began to leave and migrate to California. People migrated to places where they could acquire wealth and live a comfortable life.
In the book, they mentioned that Boise City was known as no man's land because no one was crazy enough to try and settle the land. Eventually, the government grew so desperate that they began to sell the land for a cheap price. People from different places were intrigued by this offer. Many U.S. natives and immigrants saw this as an opportunity to get rich. The government provided free train rides to those willing to take the land. The only way people would be able to keep this land was if they planted crops. To make maximum profit, they needed to produce as much wheat as the land could hold. The farmers went to some extreme measures in order to continue to plant crops. They burned the grass to make room to plant more wheat. This method was one of the major reasons the Dust Bowl began.
The government was doing what it could to convince people to settle the empty frontier land. The Homestead Act was a prime example of this, and what most families found when they arrived wasn't what they expected. They often found that the best land had already been claimed, and in the Austins case, that the projects meant to employ the new homesteaders was non-existent, just more lies. So the book and history show us that in the years leading up to the Dust Bowl catastrophe, roughly 1901 and 1930, that the Great Plains were seen as a sort of promised land to many people. Those who arrived to settle this no man's land were a variety of different ethnic groups, and although they were not all respected, they did play a role in the Great Plains society. The first group identified in the book, and that originally lived on the land, were the Native Americans, specifically the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache. Those that returned to settle upon their ancestors' land lived an inconspicuous lifestyle because of their lack of official United States citizenship. It is important to remember that this land became available after the surviving Native Americans were forced onto reservations. This meant that those who returned could be forcibly moved onto one of these reservations at any time. While the Native Americans returned to settle the land in the name of their ancestors, European immigrants arrived in search of better lives. There were German-Russian immigrants who left Germany for the Volga River region of Russia and then came to the Great Plains of the United States in order to avoid being drafted into the Tsar's army in Russia. They were known for being obsessive cleaners and were responsible for the cultivation of the drier side of the plains with the introduction of Turkey Red, a strain of resilient winter wheat that could survive severe drought native to their Russian homeland. However, despite bringing life to an otherwise desolate land, they were often discriminated against by the law, the local shops, and by the general population of Anglo-Saxons. Another group of European immigrants that settled in the Great Plains were the Jewish people. They were blamed by most Great Plains residents for the failure of the economy, and although they provided innovative services to the frontier land such as tailoring and acting, they were still seen as shifty. Finally, the largest portion of the Great Plains population belonged to the Anglo-Saxons. They were salt-of-the-earth people that farmed most of the land and owned most of the businesses that could be found in the Great Plains. The farming techniques that they used were taken from different places. Their irrigation systems consisted of windmills and a great deal of underground piping that would extract water from the aquifer below. They were not friendly towards most minority groups, especially African Americans, and they would use the police to make certain groups feel unwelcome. The settlers of the Great Plains were very selective as to who was welcomed into their towns. For example, the book addresses a sign that is posted at the edge of a city called Dalhart that said, "Black man, don't let the sun come down on you here. This is nothing short of a threat, and perfectly illustrates how the Anglo-Saxon population of the Great Plains controlled what went on in the area.
It was a great advantage to the farmers because they were able to purchase tractors. This would help them produce twice as much and maximize their profits. Because of this, there was an overproduction problem which drove the prices of the crops down. The prices of the crops remained unstable, which prevented the farmers from paying off their debts. Credit made people feel rich and like they had more money than they actually had. This would cause them to buy more things, putting them into further debt. The 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties because of the disillusionment people had that slowly led to the Great Depression. During the 1920s, about 72% of Oklahoma's population farmed. More than 60% of male and female farmers were U.S. natives. Because the majority of the farmers were U.S. natives, immigrant farmers were regularly discriminated against.
The Great Depression caused jobs to disappear and wages to fall. However, productivity did not decrease, it actually increased. This caused a problem for farmers. Food was abundant, but nobody had money to buy it, and because of this, farmers were unable to sell their crops for a profit. The value of corn was even marked at minus 3 cents a bushel at one point. In order to relieve this, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed in 1933, which paid farmers to not grow crops on part of their lands. The goal of this act was to decrease the amount of surplus crops in order to increase the value of the crops grown by farmers. After the drought hit and the Great American Dust Bowl had begun, the economic conditions of farmers began to worsen. In the early 1930s, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration began to help alleviate farmers in the Great Plains by providing money and supplies for those who needed it.
The Great Depression took everything the homesteaders had. They lost their homes and land because they could not afford to pay the debts they owed, with the price of wheat being as low as it was per bushel. When nearly a third of farmers were in debt in 1932 and many farms were being foreclosed upon, a group of farmers stormed a courthouse in Le Mars, Iowa, demanding that the judge stop signing notifications of foreclosure.
The Dust Bowl severely crippled the Great Plains. In the years before, drought and extensive deep plowing of the land caused moisture in grass that used to bind the soil to the ground to disappear. Because of this, wind erosion began to take a harsher toll on the land, causing massive dust storms. Because of these dust storms, farmers were unable to produce crops and most were forced to migrate out of the plains, although some did stay and try to survive. Over 7,000 died because of the dust phenomena, and 2.5 million were left homeless or were forced to migrate.
No matter who the settlers were, farmers, ranchers, business owners, they were all at the mercy of the powerful dust storms that were destroying what was left of the Great Plains. In the book, there's a journal entry about how the dust being carried by the storms had piled up so high that fences had been entirely covered, and another section that documents John McCarty's inability to see his own home, which was 3 feet away from him due to the density of the dust.